Right now, the world is watching the wrong thing. If you listen to the politicians in Washington or the naval commanders in the Pacific, they will tell you that the next great global conflict will be a slow, grinding war of attrition. They picture aircraft carriers enforcing a perimeter. They imagine a blockade that slowly starves an adversary over months or even years until an economy simply runs out of oil and surrenders. That is an illusion, a dangerous 20th century fantasy. My name is Jiang Xueqin, and I have spent my life analyzing the architecture of global power. And I am telling you now, if a US blockade is ever ordered, it will not last months. The victor and the victim will be entirely decided within the first 48 hours. Most people are asking the wrong question. They are asking, who has more ships? Or who has more missiles? But the real question, the one that terrifies the institutional strategists who understand modern systems, is this: who survives the instant synchronization of a global financial heart attack? We no longer live in a world where supply chains can be slowly squeezed. We live in a hyper-fragile, algorithm-driven ecosystem where capital, data, and critical resources move in milliseconds. What the Pentagon views as a geographic wall, the global markets will instantly interpret as a terminal system failure. If the Strait of Malacca is closed or the South China Sea quarantined, the collapse will not take weeks to reach your shores. It will happen before the first weekend is over. To understand why, you must stop looking at military hardware and start looking at a hidden mechanism I call the inversion trap, because the weapon Washington thinks will secure its dominance is the exact mechanism that will destroy it. And they are completely wrong. Open any Western defense white paper published in the last decade, and you will find the exact same fatal strategic miscalculation. The planners in Washington are preparing for a war that no longer exists. They look at the map and see the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 or the slow, suffocating naval embargoes of the Second World War. They operate under a comfortable, deadly assumption that time is always on America's side. The mainstream narrative tells you that a United States naval perimeter around a global rival would act like an anaconda, slowly squeezing the life out of their economy. The Pentagon assumes they can sit safely behind a wall of destroyers, waiting for the adversary's oil reserves to drain and their factories to grind to an absolute halt. It sounds logical, doesn't it? If you cut off the fuel, the machine stops. But here is the deeper point that television analysts entirely miss. That logic only works in a siloed 20th century industrial economy. It only works when the nation you are blockading is not the central nervous system of global manufacturing. Today, the United States and Europe do not operate on massive insulated stockpiles. They operate on hyper-efficient, just-in-time supply chains. This is a system optimized for maximum corporate profit, zero friction, and absolutely zero structural resilience. By attempting to starve a peer adversary, Washington fundamentally misunderstands the physics of modern globalization. You cannot quarantine the beating heart of global production without instantly inducing a massive cardiac arrest in your own body. The blockade would not be a slow squeeze. It would be a violent mirror shattering. The moment the first shipping lane is officially closed by American warships, the physical movement of cargo ships ceases to be the primary issue. The real war immediately transfers to a completely different battlefield, one that Washington cannot control with nuclear aircraft carriers or attack submarines. And this brings us to the core structural wall, the most dangerous, unforgiving dynamic in modern geopolitics. The exact reason why those very first 48 hours will dictate the absolute fate of the global order forever. When a superpower declares a naval blockade today, they are not building a geographic wall. They are pulling the pin on a synchronized financial grenade. Welcome to the inversion trap. This is the hidden mechanism that makes a modern blockade structurally impossible to survive for the nation that initiates it. Here is the deeper point that military planners routinely ignore. In a deeply entangled global economy, the kinetic weapon of a blockade instantly ricochets back through the digital financial system, destroying the blockader's own economy at the exact same speed it harms disarms the target. Let me be very clear. If Washington blockades a peer adversary, the central manufacturing hub of the entire world, they believe they are cutting off the adversary's access to oil and raw materials. But the inversion trap dictates that by doing so, America simultaneously cuts off its own access to the finished products that keep its society functioning. But the physical shortage is not even the main issue. The real shift happens in the financial markets, and it happens in milliseconds. Our global financial system is entirely driven by algorithms. These algorithms do not wait for ships to slowly run out of fuel. They trade on the immediate pricing of future risk. The exact second a blockade is officially declared, every algorithmic trading model on Earth will instantly recalculate global supply to zero for thousands of critical components. What happens next is a systemic inversion. Sovereign debt markets will instantly freeze because no bank can accurately price the risk of a world without microchips, pharmaceutical precursors, or industrial electronics. It is an immediate, synchronized global margin call. The blockading nation intends to project strength, but instead, it triggers an instantaneous run on its own domestic banks and supply chains. The weapon is turned inward. The adversary does not even need to fire a single missile to watch the blockader's financial architecture completely tear itself apart. The economic damage inflicted by the inversion trap is mathematically unavoidable. You are beginning to see the terrifying scale of the miscalculation. But to truly understand the sheer gravity of this scenario, we cannot merely look at the abstract theory. We must look at the exact timeline. We must track the collapse, minute by minute, as the trap snaps shut. Watch what happens when the clock officially starts. Here is the exact, precise, and inevitable hour-by-hour breakdown of the first 48 hours. Listen, imagine the press conference in Washington. The president announces a quarantine zone. The clock strikes zero. Within the first 60 minutes, the physical ships haven't even changed course, but the global financial architecture experiences a catastrophic seizure. This is hour one, the algorithmic panic. High-frequency trading models, programmed to price and risk instantly, dump trillions of dollars in equities tied to global manufacturing, shipping, and retail. It is a violent flash crash of absolute unprecedented scale. The stock market does not just dip, it hits automatic circuit breakers globally, freezing wealth in an instant. But that is only the digital shockwave. By hour 12, the crisis mutates into a total credit freeze. Every major commercial bank on Earth suddenly realizes that thousands of multinational corporations are now cut off from their primary suppliers. How do you issue a short-term loan to a tech giant or an auto manufacturer when their entire supply chain is legally trapped behind an American naval wall? You simply don't. The vital letters of credit that lubricate global trade completely vanish. Ships in neutral ports drop anchor. Insurance premiums for maritime freight spike by 10,000%, effectively halting all oceanic movement worldwide, not just within the conflict zone. Now we reach hour 24, the physical hoarding phase. Governments and massive corporations begin to absolutely panic. Realizing that raw materials and critical components are indefinitely severed, a violent global rush begins. Nations start seizing cargo within their own sovereign borders. Energy markets completely decouple from reality as countries hoard natural gas, oil, and refined fuels, terrified of sudden retaliatory embargoes. The global market instantly shatters into desperate, isolated black markets. Institutional trust entirely evaporates overnight, leaving a fractured, hyper-competitive void everywhere. Then comes the terminal juncture, hour 48. This is the absolute systemic breaking point where the inversion trap fully locks into place. Washington looks at their strategic map and realizes a truly horrifying truth. By attempting to isolate a peer adversary, they have accidentally isolated themselves from the exact raw materials necessary to sustain their own economy, their own vital military production, and their own fragile civilian infrastructure. The blockade has not starved the enemy. It has triggered a massive domestic economic collapse before a single physical shot was ever actually fired. The adversary has not surrendered, but the blockader system is already fracturing under the sheer brutal velocity of the economic shock. And this is where things become deadly serious for you personally. Because by the very end of this second day, this terrifying macroeconomic disaster violently breaches the absolute walls of your own neighborhood, hitting your own wallet. Watch exactly what happens to your everyday survival on the terrifying morning of day 3. Wake up on the morning of day 3. The geopolitical abstraction you watched on the news has violently kicked down your front door. This is where the macroeconomic theory of the inversion trap becomes a terrifying physical reality right in your own neighborhood. Washington assumes the American public will simply watch the blockade unfold like a distant television show. They are catastrophically wrong, because by hour 48, the global supply chain freeze translates instantly into a massive domestic supply shock. Let me explain exactly what happens when digital panic hits the physical pavement. You will drive to the gas station only to find pumps entirely dry or displaying numbers that mathematically break your monthly budget. Energy markets, completely decoupled from reality, will force local distributors to hoard reserves. Then, you will walk into your local supermarket. The shelves holding basic electronics, imported agricultural goods, and everyday packaging materials will abruptly empty. But that is not even the main issue. The real terror begins at the pharmacy. The vast majority of the active pharmaceutical ingredients required to manufacture your heart medication, your antibiotics, and your basic painkillers are produced by the very nation America just blockaded. Within 48 hours, strict rationing of life-saving drugs begins. The panic you witness is not psychological. It is a perfectly rational response to a sudden structural vacuum. The American consumer, who spent decades enjoying the frictionless luxury of cheap global imports, will suddenly absorb the entire kinetic force of Washington's strategic miscalculation. Inflation will not rise by fractions over months. It will explode overnight as an absolute, instantaneous scarcity tax. You will quickly realize that the blockade has effectively blockaded you. But here is the part almost nobody is talking about. The adversary is not sitting passively behind this naval wall, waiting to starve. They are preparing to strike back. To understand their brutal, inevitable response, we must look at a terrifying historical parallel. We must look at exactly what happens when an empire tries to suffocate a rising power. Step back into the dark shadows of history. You must understand this absolute structural reality. History does not whisper its warnings, it screams them in blood. The fundamental assumption that a blockade will force an adversary to passively starve and submit is one of the most deadly delusions ever maintained by an empire. Look back to the summer of 1941. The United States, seeking to contain a rising, expansionist Japan, imposed a crippling oil and scrap metal embargo. Washington believed that by severing Japan's access to vital raw materials, they would force Tokyo into diplomatic submission without firing a single shot. The strategy was supposed to be a bloodless strangulation, but history teaches us the absolute opposite. The embargo did not induce surrender. It induced a desperate, hyper-aggressive escalation. Faced with the mathematical certainty of their own industrial collapse, the Japanese military did not capitulate. They calculated that they had a rapidly closing window of survival, and they struck Pearl Harbor just months later. A blockade is never a slow, peaceful negotiation tool. It is always a definitive act of war that forces an immediate kinetic reaction. When you corner a superpower, you do not pacify them. You force them to use every available asymmetric weapon in their arsenal before their economy suffocates. The planners in Washington today look at a map of the Pacific and see a blockade as a mechanism of control. But the adversary looks at that exact same map and sees an existential threat that demands an overwhelming, instantaneous counterstrike. This historical parallel, this imperial echo, is the precise reason why the first 48 hours of a modern blockade are so incredibly dangerous. If the adversary knows that a prolonged economic siege will destroy them, their only logical game-theoretic move is to break the system entirely before the siege can fully set in. They will not wait for the anaconda to squeeze. They will strike at the head of the snake immediately. And this is exactly where the logic of modern warfare completely changes. The adversary will not counterattack with ships. They will use a weapon infinitely more devastating to the American way of life. They will unleash the asymmetric counterstrike. Watch closely. If Washington blockades the Strait of Malacca, the adversary will not send their fleet to break it. That is a 20th century response. Instead, within the very first 24 hours of the blockade, the adversary will launch a devastating asymmetric counterstrike directly into the absolute core of the American financial and industrial system. They know they cannot win a prolonged maritime war of attrition, so they will weaponize their own monopolies. First, they will instantly halt the export of all rare earth elements. These are the critical minerals required to build every single F-35 fighter jet, every guided missile, and every advanced radar system in the American arsenal. In one move, the Pentagon's entire supply chain for replacing its high-tech munitions is permanently severed. The American military machine will be fighting on borrowed time, completely unable to replenish its own weapons. But that is only the industrial retaliation. The financial strike will be far worse. Simultaneously, the adversary, alongside allied BRICS nations, will execute a coordinated, massive dump of United States Treasury bonds. By flooding the global market with trillions of dollars in American debt, they will intentionally trigger a catastrophic spike in U.S. interest rates. This is not a kinetic weapon. It is a financial nuclear bomb. The cost of borrowing for the U.S. government, for American corporations, and for ordinary citizens will explode overnight. Mortgages will default. Credit markets will violently seize. They will use America's own hyper-financialized system against it. The blockade was designed to isolate the adversary, but the counterstrike is designed to bankrupt the blockader. Washington planners assume a one-way projection of power. They fail to realize that power is now a two-way mirror. The adversary holds the exact structural choke points necessary to collapse the American domestic economy before the blockade even registers in their own ports. We are currently looking at a devastating scenario of mutually assured economic destruction. And this brings us to the final terrifying reality. What exactly happens when the first 48 hours are up and the smoke clears? Here are my exact predictions for the global aftermath. Please listen very carefully. The first 48 hours have passed. The inversion trap has completely snapped shut. Washington's blockade has not starved the adversary. It has initiated the largest synchronized economic collapse in human history. Here is exactly what happens next. Prediction number 1. The immediate, permanent fracture of the global financial system. Within days, the weaponization of the US dollar will force half the world to permanently abandon it. The BRICS nations will establish a parallel settlement structure, instantly destroying America's ability to export its inflation. The era of unchecked American borrowing ends overnight. Prediction number 2. The balkanization of global technology and supply chains. There will no longer be a single global market. The world will violently split into two distinct, walled-off ecosystems. If you are in the West, the era of cheap electronics, affordable green energy, and unlimited consumer goods is completely over. Scarcity will become the absolute baseline of your daily life. Prediction number 3. Severe domestic instability. When the American middle class realizes that their purchasing power has been totally obliterated by a geopolitical miscalculation, the political backlash will be absolutely unprecedented. You cannot sustain a consumer economy when the supermarket shelves are empty and credit is entirely frozen. The blockade will trigger domestic unrest far more dangerous than any foreign fleet. We are standing directly on a massive structural fault line. The politicians who casually threaten naval blockades do not understand the hyper-fragile machine they are constantly tampering with. They are playing a 20th century game on a 21st century server. When you look at the oceans, do not watch the warships. Watch the invisible data cables, the algorithmic trading desks, and the critical global choke points. Because if the order is ever given, the war will not be won or lost in months. It will be decided in a 48-hour window of absolute financial terror, and there is no undo button. My name is Jiang Xueqin. Thank you for listening. Prepare accordingly. Make sure you understand the stakes before the clock starts, because when it does, it will already be too late to act. Watch the system, not the headlines.